You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. In this episode, the point of this study is to show what we picture today. A pale, erotic aristocrat who bites necks and shuns sunlight is a recent composite assembled from traits that were once scattered across very different stories, rituals, and court files. If you follow the paper trail Dom Augustin Calmet gathered in the 1740s and the New England testimonies George R. Stetson recorded in the 1890s, you don't find capes and castles. You find depositions, autopsies, prayers, and kitchen remedies and folk magic. You find villages arguing with magistrates about corpses that look suspiciously fresh, priests negotiating what the church will bless or forbid, families in rural Rhode Island opening graves during a tuberculosis outbreak and burning a heart because a dead relative is believed to be feeding on the living. This project is, at bottom, a history of how communities try to name and manage misfortune, illness, sudden deaths, the unquiet dead, and how the label vampire keeps getting reused to make the misfortune actionable, acceptable, and maybe even profitable. Seen up close, vampire lore often cuts against modern expectations. In Calmet sources, from Hungary, Moravia, and Serbia, the vampire is not a suave seducer, but a case type more like a dead villager suspected of rising, throttling sleepers, and leaving a chain of deaths, followed by an officially sanctioned exhumation, a surgeon's inspection for signs, supple limbs, fluid blood, ruddy color, and then a remedy, staking, decapitation, and burning. In Greek and Roman antiquity, the nearest analogies, LeMay and Strige, are night witches and child killers, not reanimated corpses. In East Asia, the Yangshi feeds on qi rather than blood. In Stetson's New England, the vampire doesn't even need a name. Consumption drains families. The solution is to burn the heart of the recently deceased and scatter the ashes. Old lore, in other words, is procedural and local. It's about what to do when a certain pattern of deaths appear. Modern lore is aesthetic and individual. It's about who the monster is. That procedural spine is where religion, spirituality, and law intersect. Calmet's dossier shows clergy and civil officers treating vampirism as a juridical problem. Witnesses are sworn, graves are opened by order, bodies are examined, and acts of destruction are justified by a theology of preventing harm to the living. The same files expose spiritual cross currents. Orthodox crosses and inscriptions, Jesus Christ conquers, buried with the dead, excommunication invoked to explain incorrupt corpses. Elsewhere, customary law bleeds into folk medicine. Bread baked with blood from suspect corpses, garlic, steaks, and decapitation as a kind of vernacular surgery. Stetson's New England interviews add a secular coda. A doctor performs an autopsy before the family burns the heart. In each setting, the remedies stand at the crossing of church, courthouse, and kitchen ritual actions that also function as public health measures in absence or rejection of germ theory. From that vantage point, the modern vampire looks curated, hand-picked attributes stitched into a single charismatic figure. 19th century fiction selects immortality and bloodlust, drops the messy village epidemiology, grifts on sexual magnetism from romantic and decadent literature, and imports aristocratic glamour to make the monster legible in drawing rooms. 20th century films add sunlight allergy, mirror tricks, and a toolkit of weaknesses. What falls away is just as telling. The court records, the priest's dilemma, the family's calculus in a winter of wasting disease. By returning to Calmet's treatise on the apparition of spirits and on vampires, and Stetson's animistic vampire in New England, we cover the older landscape in which vampire was less a character than a diagnosis, a community's name for a crisis, and a set of sanctioned acts meant to stop it. That's the argument this introduction invites the audience to hold. Today's vampire is a sleek anthology of motives, but the older creature lived in the junction of belief, law, and survival. Reading the 18th century treaties beside the 19th century field notes let us watch that shift happen in real time. From exhumation reports to gothic romance, from village remedies to pop icon, and asks a larger question the sources keep pressing. When people say vampires, what are they really trying to cure? The word we use now, vampire, V-A-M-P-I-R-E, entered Western print culture in the early 18th century, almost certainly via Austrian reports out of newly occupied Serbian districts. The first widely circulated usage appears in the Vienna's official newspaper on July 21st, 1725, in a dispatch about the Kosolova case, Peter Plogojewicz, which we will talk about later. The German text reproduces a field report that includes the term in Latinized form as vampiri, the name locals used for revenants that rise from their graves to drain the living. Within a few years, the word races through German and French, and by 1732 it lands in English, often as vampire with a Y, in newspaper summaries of vampire epidemics in the Habsburg borderlands. Behind that sudden debut, though, lies a much older Slavic lexicon, upir, U-P-I-R, U-P-Y-R, attested in old Russian sources as early as 1047. The 18th century word is new, the idea complex is not. When the Habsburgs pushed the Ottoman frontier back in 1718, they absorbed districts of what is now northern Serbia and Oltenia. Military administrators and physicians soon found themselves adjudicating feverish village disputes about the restless dead. One such complaint, filed by an imperial provisor named Ernst Frumbald, was copied into the Darium on July 21st, 1725, under the dry headline, "Copy of the writing from the Gradiška district in Hungary." The body of the notice, though, was anything but dry. It described a corpse exhumed with fresh blood and supple limbs, a classic list of signs, and used the local name vampiri for the supposed revenant. That newspaper item is widely taken as the first popular Western print occurrence of the word in any spelling. It made enough noise that antiquarians and news writers across Europe began repeating it, and the term stuck. Over the next 7 years, vampire hardened into a technical label in German, French, and English news prose. The second pillar was the 1732 Latin memorandum known as Visum et Repertum, compiled by the Austrian regimental surgeon Johannes Fluckiger after an inquest near Belgrade, the Arnold Pole outbreak. Even though the report itself is in Latin, it was immediately abstracted in German, French, and English pamphlets and journals. German was VAMPIR, French was VAMPIRE, and English was VAMPYRE or VAMPIRE. Modern etymologists and historians consistently pinpoint 1725 to 1732 as the exact window when the word naturalized in Western languages. If you read those 720s to 730s sources in context, you can see what vampire meant at first contact. It isn't yet a caped aristocrat or even a standardized folk type. It's an administrative shorthand for a reverend of a particular kind, one that, according to witnesses, leaves the grave at night, assaults or throttles sleepers, causes a string of deaths within kin networks or neighborhoods, and leaves diagnostic traces in the grave: pliant limbs, rubicund skin, fluid blood, sometimes blood at the mouth, and apparent hair and nail growth. The associated countermeasure: exhumation, staking the heart, decapitation, burning to ash, are part of the same dossier, already codified in the late 17th century periodicals like the Mercure Galant. They formalized in the Habsburg inquest paperwork that Calmet reprinted. The word and the ritual kit arrived together. How convenient. In ancient Greece, creatures resembling vampires abounded in myth. The Lamia, from Greek Lamia, was portrayed as a half-woman, half-serpent monster who preyed on the living. She ate children and could transform into a beautiful woman in order to seduce young men and suck their blood. Likewise, the Emposai were female specters that fed on flesh and blood, and the Gelo were night demons who slipped into houses to attack infants. Ancient sources even call these figures the ancient equivalent of vampires. Classical literature also names the Strix, a monstrous owl demon of ill omen, as feeding on human blood. By Byzantine times and later, popular belief held that an improperly buried or evil person could rise from the grave. Traditional lore explains Greek vampire as arising when a person is not buried with the proper ritual or suffers a cruel or unjust death, so that he comes back as a vampire to get revenge. Mesopotamian myth provided some of the earliest vampire demons. The Lamashtu was a fearsome Babylonian demoness, 1st millennium BCE, who preyed on pregnant women and infants. Texts and amulets describe her as snatching newborns and drinking their blood or poisoned milk. Similarly, the Lilito spirits of Sumer and Akkad, later Judaism's Lilith, were vampiric female demons. In 2000 BCE, Gilgamesh text Lilith appears as shrieking vampiric demoness, terrorizing the forest. Over time, Lilith became associated with kidnapping children and killing mothers, eventually fused with Lamashtu's mythology. These Mesopotamian beliefs of night demons draining life from the vulnerable influenced later Hebrew and Greek lore. The Romans inherited the Greek lore and added their own demonic birds and monsters. Roman naturalists and poets mentioned the Strix, a nocturnal screech owl demon that fed on human flesh and blood. The Strix was feared as a child killer. Classical authors also preserved the Greek Lamia and Empusa stories. One ancient lexicon explains that the Lamai assumed the form of handsome women, then sucked their blood like vampires and ate their flesh, effectively labeling them what the vampires are in modern legends. Thus, both Greek and Roman traditions spoke of shape-changing female demons who drank life's blood. In later centuries, these were largely absorbed into Christian demonology, emerged with Slavic vampire myths as those spread westward. Chinese folklore developed its own vampire archetype, Yangshe, literally stiff corpse, which appears in the Qing-era legend and later. The Jiangshi is a reanimated corpse driven by residual qi, life energy, usually hopping with outstretched arms. Folklore says they rise at night and may devour the infants of people, but they do not typically suck blood. Instead, they drain the living's qi. Outside China, related beliefs spread through East Asia Buddhism. Hungry ghosts, predator, or famine-plagued spirits driven by unfulfilled desire. These Iqi, Chinese hungry ghosts, were tormented by insatiable hunger for offerings, reflecting the idea of lost souls craving life force. Festivals such as the Ghost Month include making food and incense offering to appease these hungry shades. Mesoamerican cultures had several vampire-like spirits. In Aztec myth, the Zitzamima were skeletal female star demons. At inauspicious times, they were believed to descend to Earth. If the sun's rebirth ritual failed, they would descend to devour the last of men. Likewise, the spirits of women who died in childbirth, the Chiawatitio, were thought to walk on 5 special nights each year. These fearsome of the night would haunt crossroads, kidnap children, and drain the vigor from men unless placated with shrines. Human sacrifice and skull rack rituals in Aztec religion also symbolically fed gods with blood, reflecting life force exchange. The Maya had the bat god and the jaguar demons, though sources do not emphasize blood-sucking so much as terror and decapitation. In general, pre-Columbian beliefs framed vampiric imagery as a metaphor for violent death and supernatural penalty. Ritually potent mothers and warriors became restless spirits, and nasty omens were said to steal souls or blood, similar to vampire motives. South American traditions have fewer explicit vampires, but do depict soul-stealing deities and the blood offerings to underworld gods. Hindu scriptures do not explicitly label vampires, but life-draining spirits play roles in the mythology. The most famous is the Vatala, a corpse spirit of Hindu legend. A Vatala is a ghoul-like being that hangs in cremation grounds or forests and can possess the living. Folk beliefs describe the Vatala as a dreaded being who takes delight in sucking human blood, killing children, causing miscarriages. Similarly, Rakshasas, in epic lore, are shape-shifting demons often depicted as man-eaters with fangs and red eyes. Later, folk tales describe them desecrating graves and drinking blood from skulls. In southern India, Tamil folklore speaks of the Pei and Peimakati, battlefield specters who drain the blood of a soldier dying on a battlefield, even as a merciful deliverer of a swift death. Many of these entities have parallels in Buddhism and in Southeast Asian myths. Hindu and Buddhist cosmology also include the concept of preta, or hungry ghost. A preta is a departed soul cursed with eternal hunger and thirst, often due to greed or violent death. They wander seeking offerings of water and food. Neglecting one's ancestors in ritual might produce such a suffering spirit. In East Asia, this belief blossomed into ghost festivals and rituals of Pretadana, offering alms to the hungry dead. Like a vampire, a preta is constantly hungry for life energy, though it usually cannot physically bite. Now, I would like to start getting into the first of the two books I used for this work and that I had mentioned earlier. Both compile older accounts of vampires or the like. We have Dom Augustin Calmet, Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires or Revenants of Hungary, Moravia, and more. Dom Augustin Calmet was a French Benedictine monk, biblical exegete, and historian whose scholarship straddled the worlds of rigorous Enlightenment inquiry and traditional Catholic learning. Best known in his own day for massive, methodical commentaries on Scripture and a widely used historical critical Bible dictionary. Calmet spent decades collating sources, weighing testimony, and prefacing interpretation with careful philological and historical work. Late in life, he turned that same scholarly toolkit on a sensational topic then gripping Europe: apparitions, revenants, and the reports of vampires emerging from the Habsburg borderlands. His two-volume is the first sustained quasi-academic survey of the vampire phenomenon in Western Europe. Calmet compiles depositions, military and ecclesiastical inquests, newspaper reports, and letters about cases from Hungary, Moravia, Silesia, and beyond. He catalogs signs: fresh blood at the mouth, pliant limbs, apparent hair and nail growth, community countermeasures, exhumation, staking, decapitation, cremation, and competing explanations: premature burial, natural post-mortem changes, diabolic illusion, divine permission. Crucially, he neither embraces credulity nor dismisses witnesses out of hand. His method is to present sources in full, compare variants, test them against theology and natural philosophy, and end in measured suspension of judgment. That posture, taking emic belief seriously while probing for ordinary causes, made this book a lightning rod for contemporaries and a cornerstone for later folklore, anthropology, and the modern forensic reading of vampire reports. In short, Calmet is the librarian and cross-examiner of early vampirism, the monk who gathered the dossier the rest of the field still argues with. Calmet's taxonomy and his marshalling of case materials set the agenda for 2 centuries of debate: skeptical, medical, and folkloric. Modern researchers still return to his case synopsises to track the diffusion of motives and state intervention. Here, I will go over some of the chapters that include his research and findings. Chapter 9, on vampire corpses and identification. He opens the vampire section by describing how Hungarian villagers treated suspected vampires. He explains the grave examinations were usually conducted by civil and church authorities. Witnesses were summoned, dispositions taken, and the corpses inspected for common marks of vampirism. These signs included pliancy and flexibility of limbs, a fluidity of blood, and unputrefied flesh. If these symptoms appeared, the corpse was burned. Calmet notes that even this did not always stop the specter's appearances. He insists all procedure was formal. Witnesses are generally summoned, arguments on both sides are taken. In practice, villagers first tried informal remedies, staking or pinning suspected vampires in place. Only afterwards did they seek a legal sanction to exhume the body. In a famous case Calmet records, a man named Peter, often called Plogojewicz, who I mentioned before, had died and been buried about 10 weeks when he began appearing at night to neighbors. He squeezed their throats in such a manner that they expired within 24 hours. 9 people died in 8 days. The dead man's widow even reported a visit by his ghost demanding his shoes, which terrified her and she fled the village. These events spurred the villagers to seek official permission to dig up and destroy the body. When the commanding officer and the minister inspected the corpse, they found it free from any bad smell and perfectly sound as if it had been alive. The nose was only slightly withered, but remarkably the beard and hair were grown afresh, and a new set of nails had sprung in place of the old ones. Under the old, now pale skin, a new fresh colored skin had formed, and the hands and feet were as entire as if they belonged to a person in perfect health. Crucially, the mouth was full of fresh blood, which villagers believed the vampire had sucked from the persons he had killed. Convinced by these facts, the officials allowed the body to be staked and then burned. Calmet presents this Hungarian case neutrally, detailing each step and observation. By quoting the official report at length, he emphasizes the vivid evidence of the vampire's belief: fresh hair and nails, warm blood in the mouth, etc. Yet, Calmet does not endorse a supernatural interpretation. In later chapters, which we'll go into, he will crucially assess these signs. Here, he simply records that villagers believed such marks identified vampires and that they followed local custom to burn the corpses once identified. And then we'll talk about Chapter 10, Corpses That Suck the Living. Here, Calmet leads with a formally investigated case from the Hungarian frontier. A soldier billeted in a Haidamак household watches a stranger sit down to supper. The host recognizes the intruder as his dead father and dies the next day. The matter is escalated through the regiment to the general staff, who dispatch Count D. Cabreras with fellow officers, a surgeon, and an auditor to take sworn testimony. On exhumation, the corpse is found like that of a man who has just expired, and his blood like that of a living man. So Cabreras orders decapitation and re-interment. Calmet adds 2 more depositions gathered at the same time. One corpse, dead for 30 plus years, had returned 3 times, sucking the blood of a brother, a son, and a servant, each of whom died of it instantly, after which officials found the blood fluid and drove a large nail into the temple. A third revenant, dead 16 years, was burned. The corpse of this specter was exhumed and found to be like that of a man who was just expired, and his blood like that of a living man. He had come back 3 times, sucked the blood, and all 3 died of it instantly. Calmet reproduces the most famous Habsburg Serbian dossier, the Arnold Pale affair from the Hajduk district near the Tiza, to show how local theory and practice hang together. He summarizes the folk epidemiology. The Hayduks believe certain dead persons, whom they call vampires, drain the living so that the kin visibly attenuate while the corpses swells like leeches with blood, which oozes through pores and conduits, noses and ears, even soaking the shroud. He repeats the contagion logic. Those who were sucked in life become active vampires after death, and the countermeasures: exhumation, inspect for signs, and destruction, stake, decapitation, burning. This set piece is the kernel that the 18th century medical and legal writers debated for decades. And Calmet is the arch compiler who places the official memos, surgeons' notes, and village testimonies side by side without forcing a single explanation. The people believe that certain dead persons, whom they call vampires, suck all the blood from the living, so that these become visibly attenuated, whilst the corpses fill themselves with blood, seen to come by the conduits and even oozing through the pores. They remembered that Arnold Paul had become tormented by a Turkish vampire, and that those who have been sucked suck also in their turn. What this chapter is doing analytically, I think, procedure over sensationalism. Calmet stresses that authorities hear the depositions, bring surgeons, and verify marks, pliant limbs, fluid blood, uncorrupted flesh, before authorizing execution, stake, decapitation, cremation. Even in this chapter, dense with lurid details, he keeps the spotlight on process and testimony, not just marvels. Common signs and remedies. Across cases, the diagnostics are consistent: fresh color, open eyes, fluid blood, supple limbs, blood at the mouth or pores, sometimes apparent growth of hair and nails. The remedies are the now conical triad: stake, decapitate, burn to ash, sometimes with heart removal, and then reburial. Calmet's compilation is why these protocols look so standardized in later forensic and folklore summaries. The suspended judgment. Even here, Calmet neither declares miracle nor cries fraud. He records that some observers appeal to natural philosophy, yet refuse to dismiss them outright. Calmet will praise naturalistic versus pre-natural explanations in subsequent chapters, but this unit's job is to lay down the facts. Who said what was seen on exhumation, and what was done. Now, we'll move on to Chapter 11, The Jewish Letters, Vampire Story from 1732. And basically what this chapter argues: two ways to erase belief. The author chooses hard skepticism. The Lettres Juives writer opens by saying there are only two viable strategies: either explain vampire reports by natural or physical causes, or deny the stories outright, and he thinks the second is the surest and the wisest. Even while favoring outright denial, he concedes certain appearances can occur. Some recently buried corpses may shed fluid blood, and terrified people may literally sicken or die from fear and imagination. So vampirism can be psychosomatic contagion amplified by rumor and night terrors. There are corpses which shed fluid blood, and it is very easy for certain people to fancy themselves sucked, and that fear should deprive them of life. He adds that, being haunted by such ideas by day, sleepers are naturally struck by them at night. It is very extraordinary that during their sleep the ideas of these phantoms should cause them such violent terror. He also adds a contemporary rationalist ally. To show he's not alone, the author cites Johann Christoph Herrenberg's book on vampires from 1733. Herrenberg, he notes, argues that vampire deaths are not caused by revenants at all, but by the troubled fancy of the invalids, and he underscores how imagination can derange the body. He also observes that in Sclavonia, the same stake through the heart punishment used for murderers was repurposed for alleged vampires, suggesting continuity of legal ritual, not proof of monsters. And he adds dead who eat. Anticipating the claim that ancient customs prove post-mortem agency and thus lend plausibility to vampires, he rehearses texts on food for the dead, Tertullian on pagan offerings, and Augustine on Christian funerary meals and their eventual suppression. The point is historiographical. Even if ancients behaved as though the dead fed, that doesn't validate corpse activity in graves. He concludes bluntly, all that is said of dead men who eat is chimerical and beyond all likelihood. I shall always say that the return of the vampires is unmaintainable and impracticable. And then we'll move on to chapter 12. Other recorded vampire incidents. Comment opens with local ethnography. The Haydukes believe certain dead, whom they call vampires, prey upon kin who become visibly attenuated, while the corpses, like leeches, fills with blood, sometimes seen at the mouth, pores, or seeping into the shroud. Again, we're back to Arnold Paul outbreak, sequence, signs, and remedies. Arnold Paul dies in an incident. Within 30 to 40 days, 4 neighbors die in the same manner, associated locally with vampire molestation. Paul had earlier claimed he was tormented by a Turkish vampire near Casovia, and that those who are sucked suck in their turn. He had tried protective rites, eating grave earth, smearing vampire blood, yet on exhumation about 40 days post-burial, his corpse showed all the arch vampire signs. Body was red, hair, nails, and beard had all grown again, and veins replete with fluid blood. The local Hagnagi, skilled in vampirism, orders the stake through the heart, pierced his body through and through, with a supposed frightful shriek, and then decapitation and cremation. The same is done to the 4 who died. Then there's a resurgent 5 years later with secondary cases. Despite the first purge, 5 years on a new cluster erupts 17 deaths in 3 months of different sexes and ages, some sudden and others after a short while. A memorable case, Stanoska, who wakes trembling, cries that Milo's son, dead 9 weeks, had nearly strangled her, then dies 3 days later. Exhumation shows signs. Officials and surgeons ask how the scourge returned if the first purge was thorough. Their answer is the chapter's epidemiological twist. Arnold Paul had not only sucked persons, he had killed oxen, and those who ate the oxen, including Milo's son, became new vampires. The authorities disinter a cohort of the recent dead. Among 40, 17 show the most evident signs of vampirism. So the standard stake, decapitation, burning is repeated. Ashes cast into the river. Then we have chapter 14, Vampirism from a Natural Cause. Here, Calmet entertains a naturalistic explanation proposed by others. The supposed vampires never died at all, but merely appear so. He writes, a further use may be made of these instances by supposing that the specters so much talked of in Hungary, Moravia, Poland, and etc. are nothing but persons that are still alive in their graves. In other words, perhaps these people were buried alive. Calmet acknowledges that phenomena, like fresh hair and warm blood, would then have obvious explanations. Yet he immediately points out the unanswered puzzle. If they're not really dead, how could they repeatedly come out of and back into their coffins without disturbance? This does not affect the principal difficulty, how they come out of and go into their graves without leaving any mark. Thus, Calmet shows his method. He listens to folk explanations, then raises logical objections. In this chapter, he leans toward skepticism of original causes, suggesting even common sense solutions face the inexplicable aspect of the graves being undisturbed. Thus, Calmet shows his method. He listens to folk explanations, then raises logical objections. In this chapter, he leans toward skepticism of original causes, suggesting even common sense solutions face the inexplicable aspect of the graves being undisturbed. Then on to chapter 15, we have causes, corpse, revival, and body changes. Calmet systematically addresses proposed causes for vampirism. First, he discusses how a corpse might rise and why a corpse's hair and nails might appear to grow. He notes local belief that burying victims upside down or using garlic might prevent resurrection, implying a folk concept of vampires physically leaving the coffin. Importantly, Kalmit quotes natural science to demystify the hair and nails growth. He writes, the fluidity of blood, the freshness of color, and pliancy of limbs seen in exhumed corpses are circumstances not more to be wondered at than the growing of their hair and nails. In other words, unrotted flesh and regrown nails are not supernatural. Many corpses, especially those who died violently, stay moist and retain color. He explained that dead bodies can still undergo slow chemical changes. Onions will grow after they are taken out of the earth. And similarly, a corpse's hair may lengthen post-mortem due to moisture in the grave. Kalmit frames these classic vampire signs in purely natural terms. Second, Kalmit surveys other suggested causes. He reproduces examples from periodicals like the Mercure Galant from 1693 to 1694 of villagers believing in witchcraft or curses as the cause of vampirism. He also quotes letters from the Dutch Gleaner of 1733, where local clergy argued for or against real vampires. Throughout, Kalmit remains neutral, compiling opinions from all sides: miraculous reanimation, devilish transformation, or mere animals' devices doing the damage. He seems most persuaded by naturalistic view, but never entirely rules out miracle or devil's work if proven. Chapter 16, we have the Mercure Galant accounts from 1693 to 1694. What the Mercure Galant reports and how Kalmit uses it. The Mercure Galant says that in 1693 to 1694, periodicals speak of orpires, vampires or ghosts, chiefly in Poland and above all in Russia, active from noon to midnight and sucking blood of people and animals. Again, active from noon to midnight and sucking blood of people and animals. Guess there's no sun allergy for them. In several notices, corpses are found with blood oozing. Sometimes it flows from the nose and principally at the ears. And the corpse may swim in its own blood in the coffin. Kalmit reproduces this to show a standardized popular picture of the vampire before the 18th century Habsburg inquests. The reviving being or orpire, or a demon in his likeness, leaves the grave at night, embraces and hugs violently relatives or friends, and drains them until they attenuate and die. The persecution typically runs through a family unless the revenant is stopped. An early printed version of the familial contagion logic Kalmit later details in the Arnold Payol outbreak. The Mercure Galant lists the standard countermeasures. Again, decapitation, cutting off the head, or opening the heart to halt attacks. It also preserves a folk prophylactic, mixing the vampire's blood with flour to bake bread eaten in ordinary so that the spirit returns no more. Kalmit includes this precisely because it reveals popular medicine around vampirism, not just official punishments. And then we have chapter 55, corpses chewing in their graves, on page 284. Kalmit opens bluntly. It is an opinion widely spread in Germany that dead persons chew in their graves, heard to eat like pigs. He reminds the readers he has elsewhere dismissed this as ridiculous. The imagination of those who believe that the dead chew in their graves is so ridiculous that it does not deserve refuted. In quotes. The pamphlet literature that spread it, Kalmit then names the chief authorities who popularized the notion. We have Michael Rauf, who treats grave mastication as proved and sure, claiming some dead have devoured their shrouds and even their own flesh. And then we have Philip Ribrios, an earlier tract from 1679 under the same title which Rauf cites as president. Rauf catalogs regional countermeasures which Kalmit repeats to show the ethnographic spread of the belief. Prop the jaw, a mote of earth underneath their chin in the coffin. Block the mouth, a little piece of money and a stone in their mouth. And bind the throat, a handkerchief tightly around their throat. Calmet calls these ridiculous customs and notes Raouf's citations of other German writers who mention them. The case roll, what's plausible versus what isn't. Calmet lists the set pieces Raouf and others parade, then sorts them. Buried alive, plausible. Henry, Count of Salm, interred alive, cries at night, tombed open, body found turned over. Calmet flags this as a classic premature burial. Bar-le-Duc is plausible. A man buried after heavy drink, later found to have gnawed his own arms. Calmet says this came from ocular witnesses and again implies premature burial. Then we have Bohemia 1355's reported a woman who had eaten half her shroud. Similar tales in the time of Luther of a man and a woman who gnawed their entrails. In Moravia, a dead man ate the linen of the woman buried next to him. He concedes that such things are very possible if the person wasn't truly dead. What he rejects is a leap to real corpses moving their jaws and masticating after death. All that is very possible. But that those who are really dead move their jaws is a childish fancy. What Calmet thinks is really going on? Premature burial explains the chewing cases that look credible. We have mechanical puppetry and fright culture. He likens the story to Rome's Mandicus, a carnival figure with a spring jaw that snapped to scare children. Calmet's way of saying mastication tales are staged illusion plus credulity. Like what the ancient Romans said of their Mandicus, a grotesque figure, teeth moved by springs to frighten children. The final verdict, as a general claim, the notion that the dead have been heard to eat and chew like pigs in their graves is manifestly fabulous. Now on to chapter 27, Calmet's Reflections, specifically page 288. In the final chapter, Calmet steps back to reflect on whether vampires are really dead or not. He explicitly enumerates the 5 general opinions discussed in chapter 27. Miracle, delusion, living corpses, demon trick, or animal activity. Then he gives his judgment. Calmet argues that the not dead but alive and grave theory is appealing but ultimately unsatisfactory due to the burial puzzle. He also finds the animal theory far-fetched, no animal could bite without being seen, and the good demon prank theory unsatisfying. Ultimately, Calmet suggests that many vampire cases may stem from premature burial or misidentified corpses. But he coincides he cannot definitely explain every detail. He closes by noting that many respected correspondents, even in the Gleaner, lean toward the natural explanation, yet none can answer all the objections. Thus, Calmet leaves the matter unresolved. He neither fully validates nor dismisses vampirism, but clearly leans toward a rational account. Throughout these chapters, Calmet's tone is scholarly and cautious. He quotes primary accounts in translation, provides exact page and letter references, especially with the Mercure Galant and the Jewish letters, and continuously asks logical questions. He does not simply call the phenomenon superstition, he investigates it as a serious inquiry. But the balance of his commentary favors natural causes. For example, he observes that a corpse's preserved blood and flexibility are not more to be wondered at than corpse's hair growth. By systematically covering specific cases and then offering scientific explanations, Calmet frames the vampire problem as one of data gathering and reasoned skepticism. Now, we will be moving on to George R. Stetson's 1896, The Animistic Vampire in New England. George R. Stetson, The Animistic Vampire in New England, American Anthropologist, Volume 9, Number 1, pages 1 through 13. George R. Stetson was a late 19th century American folklorist and contributor to American anthropologists whose work mixed comparative anthropology and New England vernacular belief. He gathered oral testimony and local reportages from rural Rhode Island and neighboring towns, then set those materials alongside classic European sources to show how old world ideas could persist and adapt in a modern American setting. The Animistic Vampire in New England is considered a landmark journal article. It argues that what we now call the New England vampire panic was a culturally meaningful response to tuberculosis. Families interpreted wasting illness as a dead relative feeding on the living and performed a ritual remedy, exhuming the corpse, removing and burning the heart, and scattering the ashes. Stetson's piece is prized for its mix of theory and on-the-ground detail. He maps European motifs, signs, omens, remedies, to New England practices, quotes Tyler to frame two classic vampire theories: a living soul that prays versus a dead soul that returns, and records first-hand witnesses, including a local mason and a physician. The result is the first systematic scholarly account of American vampirism, a foundation later researchers, most famously Michael Bell, built upon to interpret these rites as vernacular medicine and community crisis management rather than mere sensational superstition. And then we have the opening frame, Vampirism as Animism, pages 1 through 2. He opens with a theoretical claim. Belief in vampires and the whole family of demons is rooted in animism, the projection of agency onto unseen forces by barbarian cultures unable to separate inner experience from the outer world. He immediately positions the New England material inside a global continuum, from Chaldea to Babylonia, to Polynesia and New England, each culture naming night-visiting spirits that leave the tomb to torment the living. The belief in the vampire has its origin in animism and personification. As before suggested, it was the general belief that the vampire is a spirit which leaves its dead body in the grave to visit and torment the living. The modern Greeks are persuaded that the bodies of the excommunicated do not putrefy in their tombs but appear in the night as in the day, and that to encounter them is dangerous. And then we have Tyler's Two Theories of Vampirism and Afro-Caribbean Parallels, pages 2 through 3. The Polynesians believed that the vampires were departed souls which quitted the graves and grave idols to creep by night into the houses and devour the heart and entrails of the sleepers who afterward died. The Careens tell of Kefu, which devours the souls of men who die. The Minatira of Malay Peninsula have their water demon, who sucks blood from men's toes and thumbs. Stetson quotes Edward B. Tyler's Primitive Culture to summarize two classic theories. The first theory of the vampire superstitions, remarked Tyler, is that the soul of the living man, often a sorcerer, leaves its proper body asleep and goes forth, perhaps in the visible form of a straw or fluff of down, slips through the keyhole, and attacks a living victim. Some say these Morai come by night to men, sit upon their breasts, and suck their blood, while others think children are alone attacked, while to men they are nightmares. The second theory is that the soul of a dead man goes out from its buried body and sucks the blood of living men. The victims become thin, languid, bloodless, and falling into a rapid decline and dies. In New England, the vampire superstition is unknown by its proper name. It is believed that consumption is not a physical but a spiritual disease, obsession, or visitation. That as long as the body of a dead consumptive relative has blood in its heart, it is proof that an occult influence steals from it for death and is at work draining the blood of the living into the heart of the dead and causing his rapid decline. And now we have Old World lore and practices in detail, pages 4 through 6. A brisk tour through 17th and 18th century continental lore, mostly via Calmet and other antiquarians. The late Monsieur de Vizimont, counselor of the Chamber of the Courts of Bar, was informed by public report in Monravia that it was common enough in that country to see men who had died some time before, present themselves in a party, and sit down to table with persons of their acquaintance without saying a word and nodding to one of the party. The one indicated would infallibly die some days later. The captain of grenadiers in the regiment of Monsieur le Baron Trenck, cited by Calmet, declares that it is only in their family and among their own relations that the vampires delight in destroying their species. William of Malmesbury says that in England, they believe that the wicked came back after death by the will of the devil. And it was not an unusual belief that those whose death had been caused in this manner, at their death pursued the same evil calling. Naturally, under such an uncomfortable and inconvenient infliction, some avenue of escape must, if possible, be found. It was first necessary to locate the vampire. If on opening the grave of a suspect the body was found to be of a rose color, the beard, hair, and nails renewed, and the veins filled, the evidence of its being the abode of a vampire was conclusive. A voyager in the Levant in the 17th century is quoted as relating that an excommunicated person was exhumed and the body found fully healthy and well disposed, and the veins filled with the blood the vampire had taken from the living. In a certain Turkish village, of 40 persons exhumed, 17 had evidence of vampirism. In Hungary, one dead 30 years was found in natural state. The bodies of 5 people were discovered in a tomb near the hospital of Quebec that had been buried 20 years, covered with flesh and suffused with blood. And then we have the methods of relief. In Serbia, relief is found in eating of the earth of his grave and rubbing the person with his blood. This prescription was, however, valueless if after 40 days the body was exhumed and all the evidence of the arch-vampire were not found. In the Turkish provinces and in Greek islands was to burn the body and scatter the ashes to the winds. Some old writers are of the opinion that the souls of the dead cannot be quiet until the entire body has been consumed. Exceptions are noted in the Levant, where the body is cut in pieces and boiled in wine, and where, according to Voltaire, the heart is torn out and burned. And then we have in Hungary and in Russia, they choose a boy young enough to be certain that he is innocent of any impurity. Put him on the back of a horse which has never stumbled and is absolutely black, and make him ride over all the graves in the cemetery. The grave over which the horse refuses to pass is reputed to be that of a vampire. This old world kit of diagnostics and cures is the template against which Stetson will map New England's actions. And then we have geographic focus, why Rhode Island, pages 6 through 8. Stetson narrows to southern Rhode Island. By some mysterious survival, occult transmission, or remarkable atavism. This region, including within its radius the towns of Exeter, Foster, Kingstown, East Greenwich, and others, with their scattered hamlets and more pretentious villages, is distinguished by the prevalence of this remarkable superstition. A survival of the days of Sardanapalus, of Nebuchadnezzar, and of New Testament history in the closing years of what we are pleased to call the enlightened 19th century. It is an extraordinary instance of a barbaric superstition outcropping in and coexisting with a high general culture, of which Max Miller and others have spoken, and which is not so uncommon, if rarely so extremely aggravated, crude, and painful. And next we have primary cases, first-hand witnesses, a living mason, and a physician's report, pages 7 through 9. The first visit in this farming community of native-born New Englanders was made to a small seashore village possessing a summer hotel and a few cottages of summer residents not far from Newport, that mecca of wealth, fashion, and 19th century culture. The family is among its well-to-do and most intelligible inhabitants. One member of this family had some years since lost children by consumption, and by common report claimed to have saved those surviving by exhumation and cremation of the dead. In the same village resides an intelligent man, by trade a mason, who is a living witness of the superstition and of the efficacy of the treatment of the dead which it prescribes. He informed me that he had lost 2 brothers by consumption. Upon the attack of the second brother, his father was advised by the head of the family to take up the first body and burn its heart. When he was attacked by this disease, in his turn, advice prevailed, and the body of the brother last dead was accordingly exhumed, and, living blood being found in the heart and in circulation, it was cremated, and the sufferer began immediately to mend and stood before me a hale, hearty, and vigorous man of 50 years. When questioned as to his understanding of this miraculous influence, he could suggest nothing and did not recognize the superstition even by name. He remembered that the doctors did not believe in its efficacy, but he and many others did. At a small, isolated village of scattered houses and a farming population, distant 15 or 20 miles from Newport and 8 or 10 miles from Stewart's birthplace, there have been made within 50 years and a half dozen or more exhumations. The most recent was made within 2 years. In the family, the mother and 4 children had already succumbed to consumption, and the child most recently deceased within 6 months was, in obedience to the superstition, exhumed and the heart burned. The doctor who made the autopsy stated that he found the body in the usual condition after an interment of that length of time. I learned that others of the family have since died, and one is now very low with the dreaded disease. The doctor remarked that he had consented to the autopsy only after the pressing solicitation of the surviving children, who were patients of his. Stetson says exhumations had occurred in 5 families in one village, 3 in an adjacent one, and 2 nearby, evidence that this was not a one-off panic but a patterned response across clustered communities. He notes a similar 1875 Prussian case. A sick son exhumed his father and cut off his head, arguing that the logic of vampirism travels, but Rhode Island's persistence is sociologically specific. And then on to why has it persisted? Isolation, 2 cultures, and educated people's superstition. Pages 9 through 11. Stetson makes a sociological argument. Education and higher culture do not erase animistic thinking. 2 cultures, rational and animistic, coexist, intermingling and at times influencing each other. Even the most enlightened harbor superstitious weakness, shaped by environment and development. He cites the mathematician Sofia Kovalevskaya's belief in portents and an American mathematician who kept a horseshoe nailed over his door for 7 years. Habits of belief persist even among elites. He thinks Rhode Island's isolation, sparsely settled religions where thought stagnates, allowed the vampire remedy to survive into the late 1800s. But he's careful. The same human tendencies exist everywhere. Conditions just made them visible there. It is apparent that our increased and increasing culture, our appreciation of the principles of natural, mental, and moral philosophy and knowledge of natural law has no complete correlation in the decline of primitive and crude superstitions or increased control of the emotions or the imagination, and that to force a higher culture upon a lower, or to metamorphose or to perfectly control its emotional nature through education of the intellect is equally impossible. The 2 cultures may, however, coexist, intermingling and in a limited degree, absorbing from and retroacting favorably or unfavorably upon each other. Trifling aberrations in the inexorable law which binds each to its own place. And then we go on to Stetson's implicit diagnosis. Although he uses the language of barbaric superstition, Stetson is not writing mockery. He is offering an anthropological etiology. Tuberculosis is reinterpreted as spiritual predation inside kinship lines. The dead drains the living, making the ritual actionable medicine in a world without cures. The family clustering of TB, genetics, shared exposure, would have looked like targeted predation, so exhumation and heartburning becomes a public health ritual, however grim. This point is implicit in his data and explicit in later literature building on Stetson. Old world signs, blood in the heart, rosy corpse, renewed hair and nails, and cures, burning, decapitation, provide a cognitive script New Englanders adapt to their own illness ecology. They don't need the word vampire to behave with the vampire logic. Now, something I wanted to start adding from my own is I wanted to start showing a little bit more of TB and other things that have happened and ran along with vampirism. We have Mercy Lena Brown, Rhode Island of 1892. The best documented case after multiple consumption deaths in the family, Mercy's heart and liver were burned. A tonic made from the ashes was given to her brother Edwin. He died shortly after. A local physician, Dr. Harold Metcalf, and a reporter were present. And then we have Frederick Ransom, South Woodstock, Vermont, 1817. Dartmouth student, died of TB. Town records and press accounts note the exhumation and heartburn on a forge to protect surviving kin. We have Rachel Harris Burton from Manchester, Vermont, exhumed in 1793. Congressional Deacon Isaac Burton dug up his first wife, Rachel, to try to save his second wife, Huldah, from consumption. The ritual failed and Huldah died later that year. In New Ipswich, in New Hampshire, in 1840, physician Dr. John Clow records a family predisposed to consumption who exhumed a relative and burned the heart. He says the remedy did not work. Identifies the exhumed as Samuel Saladay. In New England, vampire cures tracked the spread of TB almost one from one. From Wellington, Connecticut, 1784, at the start of the regional epidemic, to Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892 at its symbolic end. While the ritual kit, exhumation, heart removal, burning ash tonic, functions as a vernacular public health in a world before Koch's 1882 discovery made the bacterial cause clear. Now, tuberculosis wasn't the only current running vampire stories. In the Balkans, rabies outbreaks overlapped the very decades vampire stories filled the streets. Pellagra's wasting and sun-tender skin added more bodies to read. In graveyards, decomposition physics, purge fluid, skin slippage, flexible joints looked like life to people who didn't have forensic textbooks. And a few premature burials kept the fear plausible. Even transmission had a logic. Peale's case talks about the cattle as a vector, a peasant epidemiology centuries before Koch. Some moderns tried to medicalize the myth with porphyria, but that's a late add-on. What always travels with the vampire is procedure, depositions, priests, surgeons, and a remedy the village can perform. And again, what else tracks the vampire reports? I mentioned rabies. The Balkans in the 18th century. A wildly cited medical hypothesis argues that rabies helped prime Balkan communities for vampire explanations. Symptom overlap is eerie. Nocturnal agitation, biting, attacking, hypersensitivities to stimuli, hydrophobia, sexual disinhibition, and rapid death in transmission chains. Crucially, the timelines match the classic Great Vampire Epidemic window from the 1920s to the 1950s in Habsburg Ottoman borderlands. Juan Gomez Alonso's neurology paper makes the case explicitly. Even popular summaries noted the correlation once the article appeared. In grain-dependent peasant zones, pellagra, niacin deficiency, produced photosensitive dermatitis, wasting, and neuropsychiatric changes. Historians of medicine have flagged that pellagra and rabies were epidemic during the very decade vampire stories went viral across Eastern and Central Europe. Pellagra's sunlight sensitivity and wasting fed into popular ideas of a night-active blood-draining scourge. No one claims pellagra is the vampire, only that it furnished recognizable bodily signs during crisis. Again and again, the physical proofs that triggered exhumation turn out to be normal post-mortem changes. Purge fluids at the mouth and nose, abdominal bloating, rubicund skin, flexible joints after rigor passes, and the illusion that hair and nails grew. Really, skin retraction and nail bed exposure. Forensic overviews and classic folklore analysis show how these were reliably misread as life in the grave. especially in the cold seasons or tight coffins that slowed putrefaction. Exactly the context of many 18th century inquests. Add in genuine premature burials, coma, and intoxication, and you get credible tales of chewing movement or torn shrouds within any revenant. The famous Arnold Pohl dossier explicitly describes cattle as a transmission pathway. Pohl sucked oxen. Villagers who ate the meat later died in the vampire cluster, prompting mass exhumations. Whatever we think of the belief, the file shows people thinking in contact chain terms. Humans, livestock, humans. Sound familiar? Which looks like pre-germ theory epidemiology writing under a vampire label. And just to even make this more interesting, let's add drinking blood to tales of TB, consumption, and sprinkle in some bats and rabies. In the late 1800s, consumption, tuberculosis, and weak blood iron deficiency anemia were rampant and poorly understood. Patients in several cities began drinking fresh animal blood, usually cow or sheep, straight from the slaughterhouse. Paris's Abattoir de la Villette even drew morning cues, a period engraving captions the scene plainly. Sick Parisans come to drink the blood of freshly slaughtered beef to find a cure. A medical history roll-up notes that in the 1870s, about 200 people were said to regularly drink blood at New York slaughterhouses. Take warm, usually straight from the neck, with observers pointing out that many clients were women using free blood as an iron-rich substitute when meat was scarce and unaffordable. Writers also recorded first-person tastings that normalized the practice. One famous 1870s account describes ordering a glass of blood, a butcher rinsing a tumbler, opening bullock's throat, and catching the blood in the glass, marked as a tonic for consumptives. A scholarly thesis pulls dozens of newspaper and medical items together and makes the point explicit. Blood-drinking consumptives were compared to vampire in the period press, an image that fed back into popular vampire imagery just as the literary vampire was taking form. So here we have Paris from the 1870s to the 1880s, engraved reportage of invalids lining up daily for oxblood as a cure for consumption of weak blood. New York City stockyards in the 1870s, around 200 people regularly drinking blood warm from the neck of the dying animal, orphan woman, framed as a free iron supplement. And in Cincinnati, in 1875, a published glass of bullock's blood tasting from a city abattoir, presented as a medical draught for the sick. How this ties into vampire talk? Late Victorian reporters literally likened these patients to vampires, giving you a visual, the pale invalid sipping warm blood that audiences immediately map onto the monster. The folklore dossier Calmet preserved is earlier and different, but by the 1870s to 90s, the medicalized blood drinker and the literary vampire reinforced each other in headlines and cartoons. Now we get to the bat, rabies, blood-drinking spiderweb of hysteria. A classic neurology paper argued that rabies epidemics in the Balkans overlapped the 1720s to the 1750s vampire epidemics, with very similar symptoms: nocturnal agitation, biting, hyperreactivity, sexual disinhibition, hydrophobia, rapid death, and person-to-person fear chains. The thesis isn't that people drank blood for rabies. It is the rabies made the vampire narrative plausible in time and place. Here are two folk cures for rabies. No blood drinking, but very ritualized. St. Hubert's key from Western Europe. Priests heated a special metal key and cauterized bites to prevent madness. A church-endorsed practice recorded in the late 19th and early 20th century. In medical terms, early cautery can reduce risk. In ritual terms, it mirrors vampire remedies that sacralize harm prevention. And then we have the Madstone from the U.S. Healers pressed a revered bezoar-like stone, often boiled in milk between applications, onto bite wounds to draw out rabies, hugely popular, widely reported in America. With TB, you get blood drinking as a remedy that newspapers labeled vampiric. With rabies, you get outbreaks that made vampire behavior believable, plus ritual cures that, like vampire remedies, sat at the intersection of liturgy, law, and lay medicine. And now, toss in a bat, only the New World vampire bats, 3 species, truly feed on blood. The very taxonomic naming in the 18th, 19th centuries, vampirum, spectrum, helped cement the bat vampire idea in print culture. Bram Stoker simply popularized the link already floating around natural history and newspapers, a vampire who turns into a bat. One reason the rabies vampire idea sticks is bats. The only truly blood-feeding bats are called vampire bats. In the United States, bats now account for the majority of human rabies deaths. In Latin America, vampire bats transmit paralytic rabies to cattle and sometimes people. That modern ecology retro-colors the legend, a thing that feeds at night and spreads a fatal bite. So, vampire and actual blood-feeding bat plus rabies are literally connected. And now stitching this all back to vampire lore. In cities like Paris and New York, consumptives and anemics took warm slaughterhouse blood as a tonic, and reporters called them vampires. This imagery seeped into the same decades that fixed the vampire's look in fiction, even as New England families were still exhuming TB victims. Mercy Brown is one example, and burning hearts as a vernacular public health right. In the 18th century, Balkans, rabies outbreaks, and the legal medical inquests, Calmet reprints share a time window and behavioral script. Biting, contagion, sudden death. Folk rabies cures, St. Hubert's Key, Madstones look procedurally like vampire remedies, stake, decapitation, burning. Both are authorized interventions when fear outruns science. And then we got bats. The name vampire bat, the blood meal, and their role as rabies vectors give today's audience a natural history bridge between disease and myth. Why the bite matters, why night matters, why chains of illness feel like someone is feeding. And so, after all of this has been said and discussed, it is of my opinion that, in the end, vampire turns out to be less a creature than a method, a way communities have tried to make chaos legible and stoppable. Ease the heart. Calmet's files showed us how belief became procedure. Depositions taken by candlelight, graves opened under order, a surgeon's hand on a cold wrist deciding if the signs fit the script. Stetson's Rhode Island witnesses showed us the same impulse translated into a new world. A doctor's autopsy, a family's calculation, a heart consigned to fire because tuberculosis had no cure they trusted. Between those bookends, the word carried law, religion, and folk medicine in the same breath. It named a problem, then authorized a remedy. What modernity did was curate. Fiction lifted a handful of traits: immortality, blood, seduction, and left the village epidemiology, the priest's dilemma, and the courtroom formalities. We traded a communal "what do we do now" for a solitary "who is he?" That shift produced one of the great icons of popular culture, but also flattened a messy human history into a sleek silhouette. When you put the dossier back on the table, Calmet's treatise beside Stetson's field notes, the older picture reemerges. Law crossing with liturgy, households absorbing risk, remedies that are rituals, and rituals that are public health. So as we close, hold two truths at once. The vampire we know is a brilliant anthology, a hand-picked composite that keeps evolving. And the vampire our sources knew was a social technology, a name for sudden loss and a license to act. If this survey has done its job, you can now hear both voices, the courtroom clerk reading a deposition in 1732 and the narrator of a modern Gothic. Between them lies the real story: how a label, for misfortune became a character we can't stop reinventing. And how, even now, the question behind the word still matters. When we say vampire, what are we trying to cure?